The Duke of Kestrel Chase raised his glass. "To our esteemed guests," he began, his voice a low baritone that commanded the candlelit dining room. His gaze, cool and grey as a winter sea, swept the table, acknowledging the powdered wigs and gleaming silks of Merivale's finest. It snagged for a moment on the quiet woman beside her aunt, the one in the mended grey silk that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. He faltered, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. "And to Miss Lockhart." He had forgotten her given name. Prudence Lockhart smiled, a small, perfect, meaningless curve of her lips, took a delicate sip of her watered wine, and drank to her own effacement. She had been practicing this particular smile for a decade. It was the armor of the overlooked, the shield of the unpaid companion. It revealed nothing, and cost even less. Across the table, her aunt, Lady Honora Devereux, shot her a look of pure acid, a silent reprimand for existing so inconveniently as to cause a duke to stumble. Prudence kept the smile fixed, her eyes on the floral centerpiece she herself had arranged that morning. She had also confirmed the guest list, corrected the calligrapher's spelling on 3 of the place cards, and discreetly informed the housekeeper that Lord Ashworth was violently allergic to shellfish, a detail her aunt had, as usual, neglected to pass on. Her work was invisible, its only measure of success the seamless flow of an evening she was permitted to attend, but not truly enjoy. The Duke, Gideon Sinclair, continued his toast, his composure regained. No one else seemed to have noticed the lapse, but Prudence had. She filed it away with 1,000 other small slights, a collection she never revisited, but could not bring herself to discard. It was simply the texture of her life. The dinner conversation eddied around her. Her cousin, Felicity, pretty and effervescent, laughed a little too loudly at a jest from Mr. Osmond Garrick, a man whose polished manners did little to conceal the sharp, acquisitive glint in his eyes. Lady Devereux was holding forth on the latest society scandal in London, her voice carrying the self-important weight of someone who reported news rather than made it. Prudence ate her chilled cucumber soup, her movements precise and economical. She was a master of taking up as little space as possible, in conversation, in a room, in the world. She felt, rather than saw, the Duke's gaze return to her once or twice. It was not a look of interest, but of puzzlement, as if he were trying to solve a minor logistical problem, like a mislabeled specimen in a collection. She was a thing out of place, an uncatalogued entity. The carriage ride back to her aunt's hired house in Merivale was a familiar torment. "To be so utterly forgettable, Prudence," Lady Devereux began, her voice thin and sharp as a needle. "The Duke himself could not be bothered to recall your name. You sat there like a grey stone. Did you say a single word?" "I was not addressed, Aunt," Prudence said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "You are to make yourself agreeable. That is your purpose. Felicity understands. See how Mr. Garrick hangs on her every word. You, meanwhile, fade into the wallpaper. It is a drain on my resources to even have you clothed and fed if you cannot make the smallest effort." Felicity, from the opposite seat, gave a sympathetic little sigh. "Oh, Mamma, don't be cruel. Prudence was very quiet. The Duke is so formidable, isn't he? They say he hasn't smiled since the old Duchess passed. Kestrel Chase is more a mausoleum than a house." Prudence tuned them out, watching the dark shapes of the trees flash by the window. Her aunt's words were nothing new. She was a burden, a poor relation taken in after her scholar father's death, a debt she was expected to repay with endless, silent servitude. Her father had left her books and a keen mind, but no money. Lady Devereux had inherited the house and the small income that came with it, and she never let Prudence forget it. Her room was small and cold, her days a litany of tasks. Mending linens, balancing household accounts, writing her aunt's correspondence, acting as a silent chaperone for Felicity. She was a ghost in her own life, and the Duke's forgotten name was not an insult, but merely a statement of fact. She was, to the world, no one at all. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency she could not afford to spend. When they arrived home, she helped her aunt and cousin with their cloaks, ensured a hot brick was placed in her aunt's bed, and then retired to her own small attic room. She did not light a candle. She sat by the window, looking out at the distant, dark mass of Kestrel Chase on the hill, a place as cold and remote as its master. And for the first time in a long while, she felt not resignation, but a flicker of something else. A cold, hard ember of defiance, deep in her chest. He had forgotten her name, but she had not. The next morning, a footman from Kestrel Chase arrived. Prudence saw him from the parlor window, his crisp blue and silver livery a stark slash of color against the drab Merivale street. She expected a formal thank-you note for her aunt, another tedious missive she would be tasked to answer. But the footman asked for her, specifically for Miss Prudence Lockhart. Lady Devereux, who was rearranging porcelain figures on the mantelpiece, froze. "For Prudence? Are you certain?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. The footman was certain. The letter was handed over, a heavy cream envelope sealed with the ducal crest. Prudence took it, her fingers steady. Inside, the note was brief, written in a strong, dark, angular hand. It requested her presence at Kestrel Chase at 2:00 that afternoon. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. "What is this about?" her aunt demanded, snatching the note from her hand. She read it, her thin eyebrows rising. "The Duke wishes to speak with you. On what matter?" Her mind was clearly racing, calculating possibilities, opportunities. "It must be about your father. Yes, that must be it. The late Duke was an acquaintance of your father's. This Gideon Sinclair must have some scholarly query. See that you wear your best day dress, the blue one, and for heaven's sake try to speak. Do not sit there like a pudding." Prudence said nothing. She retrieved the note and went to her room. The blue dress was her best, but it was 3 years out of fashion and strained slightly at the seams. She brushed it carefully, mended a tiny fray at the cuff, and braided her plain brown hair into its usual severe coronet. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. A plain face, serious eyes, a mouth that had forgotten the habit of easy smiling. There was nothing there to interest a duke. Her aunt was right. It had to be about her father. She walked to Kestrel Chase, declining her aunt's offer of the carriage. She needed the air, the steady rhythm of her own feet on the gravel path, to calm the unfamiliar fluttering in her stomach. The house loomed larger as she approached, a magnificent edifice of pale stone that seemed to have grown from the hill itself, stern and beautiful, and utterly uninviting. The footman led her not to a drawing room, but to a study. It was a deeply masculine room, paneled in dark wood, smelling of leather and beeswax, and something colder, like stone. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, but they were in perfect, undisturbed order. This was not a room for reading. It was a room for display. The Duke of Kestrel Chase was standing by the window, looking out over the formal gardens, his back to her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence filling the silent room. "Miss Lockhart," he said, without turning. His voice was the same low baritone from the dinner, but without the veneer of social obligation. It was clipped, precise. "Thank you for coming." He turned then, and his gray eyes assessed her with an unnerving directness. There was no apology in them, no social warmth. It was the gaze of a man who dealt in facts. "I was remiss last night. It was an inexcusable lapse of memory." It was not an apology. It was a statement of his own failure, offered without excuse. "It was of no consequence, Your Grace," Prudence replied, her own voice quiet and even. "It was a consequence of my own inattention," he corrected her. "I do not abide it in my staff, nor in myself." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." She did. He remained standing, a formidable column of black, superfine wool. "Your father was Professor Alastair Lockhart." Again, a statement, not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." "He was the foremost authority on medieval manuscripts in the country. He corresponded with my father for many years. Upon my father's death, his entire collection of letters and manuscripts was left to me. It is housed in the West Library. It has not been touched in a decade. It is, to be plain, a disaster." He paused, his eyes fixed on her face, searching for something. "I am told you assisted your father in his work, that you are familiar with his methods of cataloguing." Prudence felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss. She thought of her father, of the happy, dusty hours spent in his study, the smell of old vellum, the shared joy of a difficult translation solved. "I did, Your Grace, from the time I was a girl." "I require someone to bring order to that chaos," the Duke said. "I wish to hire you to catalogue the collection. You will be paid a fair wage for your time. You will have unrestricted access to the library and any resources you require. The work is likely to take several months. Are you interested in the position?" It was so direct, so transactional, that it took her a moment to process. He wasn't offering charity. He wasn't making a social gesture. He was offering her a job. A job that would use her mind, the part of her that had been dormant for years. It was a lifeline. More than that, it was a recognition. He might have forgotten her given name, but he remembered her father's. He knew of her skills. In that moment, he saw her more clearly than anyone had in a very long time. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, and for the first time, her voice was not just quiet. It was steady. "I am very interested indeed." The negotiation of her employment was as swift and unsentimental as the offer itself. Prudence, emboldened by the prospect of meaningful work, found a resolve she had not felt in years. When the Duke asked what she would consider a fair wage, she did not demur. She named a figure. It was modest, but it was a proper sum for a skilled archivist, a number her father had once mentioned in passing. She stated it plainly, without apology. A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps respect, crossed the Duke's impassive features. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Done." He then asked about her required hours. "I would need from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening, Monday through Friday," she stated. "I will require silence and solitude to perform the work to the best of my ability. The library is on the west wing. It is isolated. You will not be disturbed," he assured her. "Mrs. Abbott, my housekeeper, will see to any needs you have. I will have a contract drawn up this afternoon. You may begin tomorrow." And that was that. The interview, if it could be called such, was over. He walked her to the door of the study, a silent, imposing figure. As she was about to leave, he spoke again, his voice low. "Miss Lockhart, your father's work was of great importance. I expect you will honor his legacy with the same meticulousness." "I will, Your Grace," she said, meeting his gaze. "It is the only way I know how." Returning to her aunt's house was like stepping from a world of clear lines and hard facts into one of cloying smoke and mirrors. Lady Devereux was practically vibrating with excitement and suspicion. "Well, what did the great man want? An offer of marriage, no doubt," she said, her attempt at a jest laced with genuine, greedy hope. "He has offered me a position, Aunt," Prudence said, handing her the new gloves she had bought in the village on her way back, a small peace offering. "He wishes for me to catalogue his late father's collection of manuscripts. He has offered to pay me for my time." Her aunt stared at her, her face a mask of disbelief that slowly morphed into cunning. "Pay you? A wage? Like a common governess?" The insult was automatic, but her eyes were gleaming. A wage meant money. Money she could control. "Well, that is respectable, I suppose. A very great honor for you, of course. Naturally, your earnings will come to me to defray the significant costs of your upkeep. But it is a connection, a foothold in that house. You must be charming, Prudence. You must make yourself indispensable." Prudence did not argue. She had expected this. But as she went to her room, she felt the weight of the coins she had insisted be paid directly to her weekly in cash. Her aunt could demand it, but she would be the one to receive it first. It was a small but significant victory. For the first time, she would have something that was hers. Her first day at Kestrel Chase was daunting. Mrs. Abbott, the housekeeper, met her at the door. She was a tall, severe woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and an expression that suggested she had just bitten into a lemon. Her black dress rustled like dry leaves. "Miss Lockhart," she said, her voice devoid of welcome. "His Grace has informed me. I am to show you to the West Library. The Duke does not like fuss." "I am not here to make a fuss, Mrs. Abbott," Prudence replied calmly. "I am here to work." The housekeeper led her through a labyrinth of silent, dust-sheeted corridors. The air was cold and still. Kestrel Chase was not a home. It was a monument to a life that had ended. They arrived at a set of tall, carved oak doors. Mrs. Abbott produced a heavy iron key and turned it in the lock. The sound echoed in the silence. The doors swung inward, releasing a sigh of stale, papery air. The library was magnificent and heartbreaking. It was a vast, two-story room with a gallery running around the upper level, all of it lined with books. But a thick coat of dust lay over everything, and the grand windows were so grimy that the morning light struggled to penetrate, falling in weak, hazy shafts filled with dancing motes. Stacks of leather-bound volumes were piled on the floor, crates of letters sat unopened, and scrolls were bundled haphazardly on tables. It was a treasure trove in complete disarray. It was her father's idea of heaven and a housekeeper's idea of hell. "His Grace has not entered this room since the late Duchess passed away 5 years ago," Mrs. Abbott said, her voice a fraction softer, as if imparting a state secret. It was her favorite place. That explained the profound sense of neglect. It was not just a library. It was a sealed tomb of grief. Prudence felt a wave of sympathy for the cold, quiet man who was now her employer. She walked to the center of the room and ran a finger over a dusty table, leaving a clean streak. "I will need soap, water, cloths, and lemon oil," she said. "Before any cataloging can begin, the entire collection must be cleaned." Mrs. Abbott looked taken aback, as if she expected Prudence to simply sit down and begin reading amidst the grime. But after a moment, she gave a curt nod. "As you wish, miss." She left, her footsteps receding down the long hall, leaving Prudence alone in the silent, forgotten heart of Kestrel Chase. Prudence took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of decay and potential. She rolled up the sleeves of her practical brown dress. The work was immense, but it was hers, and in that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of scholarship and sorrow, Prudence Lockhart felt, for the first time in a very long time, as though she had come home. The days that followed fell into a quiet, purposeful rhythm. Each morning, Prudence would walk the mile to Kestrel Chase, arriving precisely at 9. Each evening, she would walk back, her mind full of dates and names, her hands smelling faintly of old paper and lemon oil. The first week was dedicated entirely to cleaning. With the help of 2 young housemaids dispatched by a grudging Mrs. Abbott, she supervised the painstaking process of wiping down every shelf, cleaning every window pane, and dusting every single book. Light began to flood the room, revealing the rich grain of the wood and the faded gilt on 1,000 spines. The library began to breathe again. Once the room was clean, the real work began. Prudence established her system, just as her father had taught her. She set up a large table as her workspace, with neat stacks of paper for notes, bottles of ink, and her father's old magnifying glass. She started with the crates, tackling the correspondence first. It was a slow, methodical process of sorting, reading, and documenting. She created categories: family letters, scholarly correspondence, estate business. Her handwriting, a clear, precise cursive, began to fill the pages of the new ledger she had purchased in Maryvale with her own money. She was creating order from chaos, and it was the most satisfying work she had ever known. She rarely saw the Duke. She was aware of his presence in the house, a silent, gravitational force, but he kept to his word and did not disturb her. Yet she began to notice small things. One afternoon, chilled by the stone walls, she found a thick woolen shawl draped over her chair when she returned from her simple lunch of bread and cheese. Another day, a fresh pot of tea and a single porcelain cup appeared on her work table precisely at 3 o'clock. She never saw who brought them. She suspected Mrs. Abbott, acting on silent orders. These small, anonymous kindnesses were more eloquent than any conversation. They were acknowledgments of her existence, of her work. One evening, she stayed late, engrossed in a series of letters between the old Duke and a botanist from the Royal Society. The light was fading, and she was squinting at the spidery script when she heard a sound at the door. Gideon Sinclair stood there, holding a lit candelabra. He was not dressed for dinner, but in a simple shirt and breeches, as if he had been working himself. He did not speak, but walked to her table and set the candelabra down, its 3 flames casting a warm, flickering glow over her papers. "You will ruin your eyes," he said. It was not a criticism, but a simple statement of fact. "I had not noticed the time," she confessed, looking up at him. In the soft candlelight, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. She could see the weariness in his eyes. He picked up a letter from the table, his long fingers gentle with the fragile paper. "You are making progress." "There is a great deal to be done, but the system is in place," she said. "Your father had a fascinating correspondence." He nodded, his gaze distant. "He lived for these things, paper and ink." He looked around the room, at the newly ordered shelves, the gleaming surfaces. "My wife, Rosamond. She loved this room. She would read in that chair by the window for hours. He gestured to a worn brocade armchair that Prudence had carefully cleaned. After she died, I could not bear to come in here. It was the most personal thing he had ever said. A crack in the granite facade. He had shared a piece of his grief with her, and the quiet intimacy of the confession hung in the air between them. He seemed to realize he had spoken too freely, and his reserve returned like a shutter closing.
Mrs. Abbott will have a dinner tray sent up for you. Do not work too late. He turned and left as silently as he had come, leaving her in the golden pool of candlelight, her heart beating a little faster. The library was no longer just a place of work. It had become a space of quiet communion, a sanctuary where two lonely people could exist in a shared, respectful silence. The house was still a monument, but she was slowly, carefully, letting the light back in. The change in Kestrel Chase did not go unnoticed. Servants began to speak of the West Library being open again. The scent of beeswax and flowers from the garden, which Prudence had taken to cutting for a small vase on her desk, began to drift into the main corridors. Mrs. Abbott's demeanor toward her had thawed from icy suspicion to a grudging, crisp respect. She would now greet Prudence with a nod, and sometimes even a brief comment on the weather. These were seismic shifts in the frozen world of the ducal household. Nor did the change go unnoticed in Maryvale. Lady Devereux, on one of her infrequent and always unwelcome visits to supervise Prudence's work, was stunned into a rare silence by the transformation of the library. She saw the order, the light, the subtle signs of the Duke's approval, and her eyes narrowed with a fresh wave of calculation. She saw Prudence not as a niece to be pitied, but as an asset to be managed, and perhaps a rival to be controlled. Her visits became more frequent. She would arrive with Felicity in tow, ostensibly to take tea, but really to assess the situation. She would pepper Prudence with questions, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "And does the Duke often visit you in here, dear? You must be having such fascinating conversations. He is such a clever man." "His Grace is occupied with the estate," Prudence would reply, never looking up from her work. "We rarely speak." It was the truth, but not the whole truth. The conversations were not in words, but in the silent provision of a warm shawl, in the shared space of a quiet room. It was during one of these visits that Mr. Osmond Garrick first saw the library. He had escorted the Devereux ladies and was making himself charmingly at home. He strolled into the library, a look of proprietary admiration on his face. "My word, Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "You have worked wonders. One might almost think you were the lady of the house already." The insinuation was clear and unpleasant. Prudence felt a flush of anger, but kept her expression neutral. "I am an employee of the Duke, Mr. Garrick. Nothing more." Of course," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. But he watched her, and he watched the room, and she saw the cold ambition in his eyes. He was courting Felicity, but his true prize was influence with the Duke, and through that, access to the wealth and power of Kestrel Chase. He saw Prudence not as a person, but as a pawn on the board, and a potentially troublesome one at that. The whispers began soon after, little murmurs in the drawing rooms of Maryvale, that the quiet Miss Lockhart was setting her cap for the Duke, that she was using her position to worm her way into his confidence, that she was far more cunning than she appeared. Prudence heard none of it directly,
but she felt it in the way people looked at her in the village, in the sudden chill from acquaintances who had once been friendly. Her aunt, far from defending her, seemed to encourage the rumors with sly hints and knowing looks. It suited her to have Prudence's reputation be a subject of gossip. It made her more interesting, and, by extension, made the Devereux family more central to the local drama. The attack, when it came, was more direct. A small but very valuable book of illuminated psalms went missing from a locked cabinet in the library. Prudence was the only person, besides the Duke himself, with a key. Mrs. Abbott reported the loss to the Duke with a grim face. Prudence knew at once she was under suspicion. The Duke summoned her to his study. He did not accuse her. He simply stated the fact. "The Malmesbury Psalter is gone." "I did not take it, Your Grace," she said, her voice low but firm. "I last saw it on Tuesday when I was dusting the cabinet. I have not opened it since."
"Who else has been in the library?"
"My aunt and my cousin visit, and Mr. Garrick has been here with them." The Duke's face was unreadable.
"I see."
He did not press her further. He did not call the constable. He simply dismissed her. The air between them, once so clear and quiet, was now clouded with the ugliness of suspicion. For the next 2 days, the tea did not arrive at 3 o'clock. The shawl was gone from her chair. The silence in the library was no longer companionable. It was heavy and accusatory. Prudence continued her work, her movements precise, her focus absolute. It was all she had. If he believed her a thief, then her integrity was all that was left. She would work until he dismissed her, and she would leave with her head held high. On the 3rd day, the book reappeared, tucked behind a larger volume on a different shelf. Nothing was said, but the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted, and Prudence knew, with a cold certainty, that her enemies were not finished yet. The final assault was a masterpiece of quiet cruelty. A week after the Psalter incident, Lady Devereux requested a private audience with the Duke. She arrived looking grave and distressed, clutching a letter in her hand. She presented it to him with a great show of reluctance and sorrow. "Your Grace, it pains me to bring this to you," she sighed, dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "I would not have believed it of my own niece, but I cannot stand by and see you deceived." The letter was written on cheap paper, in a passable imitation of Prudence's clear hand. It was addressed to a supposed creditor in London. The text was damning. It spoke of the Duke as a lonely, malleable man, easily influenced. It boasted that the writer would soon have access to the Sinclair fortune and would be able to pay off all her late father's debts and more. It was a vile caricature of her, painting her as a mercenary and a predator. It was signed P. Lockhart. When Lady Devereux had departed, leaving the poison to do its work, Gideon Sinclair sat alone in his study for a long time, the letter on the desk before him. He read it again and again. Every line was an insult to his intelligence, a stain on the quiet respect he had built with the woman in his library. All his instincts, honed by years of solitude and a deep-seated distrust of social maneuvering, screamed that this was a lie. It was too theatrical, too convenient. It was the work of people like Osmond Garrick, who spoke in honeyed falsehoods, and Lady Devereux, whose ambition was a fetid perfume. And yet, the evidence was there. The handwriting was a close match. The story of a poor relation seeking to secure her future was a plausible, if ugly one. He thought of the missing book. He thought of the whispers from the town. Was he a fool? A lonely man so starved for simple competence and quiet companionship That he had overlooked the obvious? His grief for his wife had made him a recluse. Had it also made him naive? He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the unchanging, orderly lines of his garden. He prized evidence. He made decisions based on facts, not feelings. The fact was on his desk. The feeling was in his gut. For the first time in 5 years, the two were at war. He picked up the letter. He noted the paper stock, the way the ink had feathered slightly at the edges. He thought of Prudence in the library. He thought of her steady hands, her calm eyes, the way she handled fragile manuscripts with a reverence that could not be faked.
He thought of the day she had quoted a wage, not with grasping greed, but with the quiet confidence of a professional stating her worth. Nothing about this letter squared with the woman he had observed for months. It was not pity he felt for her. It was something harder and more respectful. It was a belief in her character. And he would not let that be destroyed by a piece of paper. He had made his decision. He would not rely on the testimony of others. He would get the truth from her himself. He sent a footman not to the library, but to her aunt's house in Maryvale that evening. The summons was for the following morning. Prudence spent a sleepless night, her mind a turmoil. The cold silence from the Duke had been punishment enough. A formal summons could only mean dismissal. She dressed in her plainest gown, the gray one she had worn to the first dinner party. It felt like coming full circle. She would face her accuser with the same quiet dignity with which she had faced his forgetfulness. She found him in his study. The forged letter lay in the center of his large mahogany desk. He did not ask her to sit. He stood, his face carved from stone, and gestured to the letter. "I am told this is your work," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am told you wrote this. I am asking you now, Miss Lockhart. Answer me plainly." Prudence walked to the desk. She did not touch the letter, but looked down at the clumsy forgery of her own hand. She felt a cold, cleansing anger wash away her fear. Her voice, when she spoke, was as clear and steady as a winter stream. "I did not write that letter, Your Grace." "Your aunt says you did. The handwriting is similar." "It is a clever imitation," she acknowledged, "but it is not perfect. Look at the capital L in Lockhart. I loop mine from the bottom up. That one is looped from the top down. It is a small thing, but my father was a paleographer. He taught me that such details are everything." She paused, then looked up, meeting his intense gaze directly. "But there is a more definitive proof. My father also taught me about paper stock. May I touch it?" He nodded. She picked up the letter, her fingers assessing the texture, the weight. She held it to the light from the window. "This paper has a watermark from the Watman Mill. They only began using this particular mark last year. The letter is dated 2 years ago." She laid it back on the desk. She did not plead. She did not weep. She presented facts. "It is an impossibility. A fraud." Silence descended on the room, thick and heavy. The Duke stared at the letter, then at her. He saw no fear in her eyes, no guile. He saw the unshakable certainty of the truth. He had trusted his instinct, and she had rewarded it with evidence. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of humor, but of vindication. "A fraud," he repeated softly. "Yes, I believe it is." He took a step towards her. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Lockhart. I will handle this. Please, return to your work. Your tea will be waiting. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Prudence returned to the library, her legs unsteady beneath her. The promised tea was there, steaming in its delicate cup. The woolen shawl was once again draped over her chair. The silent communion was restored. She did not know what the Duke meant by handling it, but she felt a profound sense of relief. She had been tested, and she had not been found wanting. She had spoken the truth, and he had believed her. In her small, quiet world, it was a victory more profound than any social triumph. A week later, invitations were sent from Kestrel Chase for a formal dinner. It was to be the largest social event the Duke had hosted in 5 years. All of Merivale society was abuzz. The guest list was exclusive, and at the very top, as guests of honor, were Lady Honora Devereux, Miss Felicity Devereux, and Mr. Osmond Garrick. An invitation was also delivered to Prudence, not as a command to an employee, but as a formal request to a guest. It was addressed to Miss Prudence Lockhart, and her name was spelled perfectly. Lady Devereux was triumphant. "You see," she crowed, waving the invitation. "The Duke has clearly seen the truth of the matter. He is casting you off, Prudence, but he is too much of a gentleman to do it publicly. He is honoring us, for our loyalty and for exposing your deceit. Garrick will surely propose to Felicity after this. Our futures are made." Prudence said nothing. She knew her aunt was wrong, but she had no idea what the Duke was planning. She felt a knot of apprehension in her stomach. She agreed to attend, knowing she had no choice. It was a command performance, and she was a central, if unwilling, player in a drama whose final act was yet to be written. The night of the dinner, she wore the same mended gray silk. It was the only formal gown she owned. It was her uniform of quiet endurance, and she would wear it into battle. The dining room at Kestrel Chase glittered. The long table was set with the finest Sinclair silver and crystal, gleaming under the light of a dozen chandeliers. The air hummed with polite conversation and the scent of beeswax and roasted quail. Prudence was seated halfway down the table, between a quiet country squire and his even quieter wife. At the head of the table, Gideon Sinclair presided, a dark, silent monarch at his own court. Lady Devereux, seated to his right, was in her element, her voice carrying across the table. Mr. Garrick, on his other side, was the epitome of charm and confidence. He and Lady Devereux believed they had won. They were basking in the warmth of their perceived victory. Another guest, seated near the Duke, watched the scene with shrewd, intelligent eyes. The Dowager Countess of Marley, an old friend of the Sinclair family, was a woman whose sharp tongue and even sharper mind were legendary. She had observed Prudence in the village, had noted her quiet dignity, and had been watching the drama unfold with keen interest. The meal progressed through several courses. The conversation was stilted, overshadowed by the Duke's formidable silence. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared, Mr. Garrick, catching a signal from Lady Devereux, cleared his throat. He raised his wineglass. "Your Grace," he began, his voice ringing with false sincerity, "on behalf of all your guests, I want to thank you for your magnificent hospitality, and also for your discernment. In these trying times, it is a comfort to know that men of character can still see the truth of a situation and reward loyalty and honesty, while quietly dealing with less scrupulous elements." His eyes flickered towards Prudence for a fraction of a second. It was a public execution, delivered with a smile. A murmur went through the room. All eyes turned to Prudence. She felt the heat of their stares, but she did not flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on her water goblet, her back straight, her hands still in her lap. Then, the Duke stood up. The room fell silent. "Thank you, Mr. Garrick," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You speak of discernment, of evidence. I find myself in complete agreement. It is a subject I have been considering a great deal of late." He held up a single sheet of paper. It was the forged letter. "Some of you may be aware of a malicious rumor concerning a member of my staff. It was suggested she was a woman of low character, a fortune hunter. This letter was presented to me as proof." Lady Devereux went pale. Mr. Garrick's smile froze on his face. "Your Grace, surely this is not a matter for public—" "It is entirely a matter for the public," the Duke cut him off, his voice like chipping ice. "When a reputation is publicly slandered." He looked directly at Garrick. "I am, as you say, a man who values evidence. So I sought it." He produced a second document. "This is a report from Mr. Phileas Croft of London, the country's leading expert on paper and ink. He confirms that the paper on which this letter was written was manufactured last year, making its date of 2 years ago a chronological impossibility." He let that sink in. The silence in the room was now absolute. "He also notes that the ink is of a cheap variety, commonly sold in the stationer's shop here in Maryvale. The same shop, I am told, where you purchased your writing supplies last Tuesday, Mr. Garrick." Garrick looked as if he had been struck. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The Duke was not finished. He turned his cold gaze on Lady Devereux. "The letter was brought to me by Lady Devereux, who claimed to be acting out of concern for my welfare, a concern so great that she failed to notice her own niece's handwriting was being clumsily forged, a concern so profound that she was willing to destroy the reputation of a girl she was sworn to protect." It was then that the Dowager Countess of Marley spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I have heard enough," she said, her eyes flashing. "I have known 3 generations of Sinclairs, and I have known 3 generations of Devereuxs. The Sinclairs have always prized honor. The Devereuxs, it seems, now prize ambition above all else. To attack a defenseless girl for your own petty gain. It is not merely cruel, Honora. It is vulgar." The word, spoken with such aristocratic contempt, was the final, killing blow. Lady Devereux crumpled in her seat as if her spine had dissolved. Mr. Garrick, his face a mask of sweat and terror, pushed his chair back and fled the room. Felicity burst into tears, a lost child in the wreckage of her mother's ambition. The public reckoning was complete. The house of cards had not just fallen, it had been utterly annihilated. In the stunned silence that followed the rout of his enemies, the Duke's gaze found prudence. The other guests were beginning to stir, whispering amongst themselves, a flock of birds startled by a sudden shot. They were already turning on the Devereuxs, shunning them with their eyes. That is how counties turn on their own, quietly, by degrees. Prudence stood, intending to slip away in the confusion. Her work was done. Her name was cleared. There was nothing left for her here. "Miss Lockhart, do not go." The Duke's voice was not loud, but it cut through the rising murmur of the room. He walked the length of the table, his steps measured and deliberate, until he stood before her. The remaining guests fell silent again, watching, sensing that the true climax of the evening had not yet arrived. He looked at her, at the plain gray dress, the steady eyes, the quiet dignity that had not faltered even under the most vicious public attack. "They sought to diminish you," he said, his voice for her alone, though all could hear it. "They failed. You are the strongest person I have ever met." He spoke of the house, of the cold, empty life he had lived within its walls since his wife's death. He spoke of the silence and the dust and the grief. "You came here to catalogue my father's books," he said, his gray eyes holding hers. "But you did more than that. You brought order. You brought light, not just to the library, but to this entire house, to me." He took her hand, his grasp warm and firm. And then, before the assembled gentry of Merryvale, Gideon Sinclair, the cold, remote Duke of Kestrel Chase, went down on one knee. A collective gasp went through the room. "I forgot your name once, Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I swear to you, I will never forget it again. Prudence." He said her name as if it were a prayer. "I am not offering you a rescue. I am asking you to choose. To choose this house. To choose me. Will you be my wife?" The world seemed to fall away. There was only his face, his earnest, searching eyes, his hand holding hers. She had spent her life enduring, accepting, making herself small. He was asking her to choose, to expand, to become. It was the greatest question she had ever been asked, and the answer was the simplest thing in the world. She thought of the quiet companionship, the shared silence, the anonymous gifts of tea and warmth. It was a love built not on poetry, but on proof, on the evidence of character. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady in the silent hall. "Yes. Plainly, yes." 1 year later, the great lawn of Kestrel Chase was filled with the sound of laughter. Prudence, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, stood on the terrace, watching the children from the village play games as part of the annual summer fete, a tradition she had reinstated. The house behind her was no longer a silent monument. Its windows were thrown open to the warm air, and the scent of baking cakes drifted from the kitchens. Gideon stood beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back. He was smiling, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached his eyes, and the sight of it still made her heart ache with a quiet joy. He followed her gaze to where Mrs. Abbott, her severe face softened into something approaching cheerfulness, was handing out lemonade to the children. In a quiet corner of the garden, a young woman was patiently showing a small boy how to make a daisy chain. It was Felicity. After the disastrous dinner party, Lady Devereux had retired in disgrace to Bath, her social standing in tatters. Felicity, humbled and ashamed, had written a stilted, tear-stained letter of apology to Prudence. Prudence, seeing the daughter who had been a pawn in her mother's cruel games, had answered with grace. Felicity now lived in a small cottage on the estate, finding a quiet purpose in helping with the parish charity work. She caught Prudence's eye across the lawn and gave a small, shy smile. It was not a full forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of a fragile peace. Later that evening, when the last of the guests had gone and a quiet contentment had settled over the house, Gideon led Prudence into the library. The room was the vibrant, beating heart of their home now. A fire crackled in the hearth. The shelves were orderly, but not untouched, and books lay open on tables, waiting to be read. It was a room that was loved and used. He handed her a small, leather-bound volume. It was a first edition of one of her father's scholarly works, a book she had thought lost forever. She opened the cover. On the flyleaf, in the Duke's strong, angular hand, was an inscription. For Prudence Sinclair, the heart of Kestrel Chase. Tears she had refused to shed in sorrow now welled in her eyes from happiness. She looked up at him, her husband, the man who had seen her when she was invisible. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. He did not speak, but simply leaned in and touched his forehead to hers, a gesture of profound and silent communion that had become their private language. Then he pulled back slightly, his hand cupping her face, his gray eyes warm in the firelight. "Prudence," he said softly. Not as a question, not as a statement, but simply to say her name, to affirm her existence. And she smiled, a true, radiant smile that came from the very depths of her soul. She was home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.